Thank you very much everyone for coming. This press conference is hosted by the Gaia Foundation along with the African Biodiversity Network, International Agriculture and Trade Policy, IATP, and EcoNexus. The subject of, well actually maybe I should introduce my colleagues here. My name is Teresa Anderson. This is Wanjiku Maina from African Biodiversity Network. To her right is Helena from EcoNexus, and Steve Suppan from IATP. Our groups have come together because we're very concerned about the dialogue taking place at the moment about the need for these negotiations to include agriculture. We recognise that obviously agriculture is absolutely critical to the issue of climate change, it's critical to all our food security, but we question whether the approach being pushed is really the right solution. Many of you may have caught that President Jacob Zuma at the beginning of this week said that he was very keen that the COP17 should come up with an outcome on agriculture. And this has been welcomed by some parties, but also greeted with great concern by others. And what many of you may also know is another dimension to these negotiations is the big picture, how while the European Union has been making proposals that would seriously compromise Africa in terms of the discussion about emissions targets and the ongoing mandate for a legally binding agreement. So South Africa seems to be standing with the European Union rather than with the African Union. And so we are concerned that this discussion about agriculture being pushed by Jacob Zuma is supposed to be like a SOP, a consolation prize to the rest of Africa when he's actually selling them out the back door. So we would say that an agreement on agriculture at COP17 is supposedly a consolation prize to Africa for failure on legally binding targets. But this consolation prize is itself a poison chalice because, as we're going to go on to explain, an agreement on agriculture will basically lead to land grabs and deliver African farmers into the hands of fickle carbon markets. What's happening is that this discussion about agriculture is not really at the deepest level about improving agriculture for small-scale farmers, although that's what's being said. It's about expanding carbon markets. Carbon markets are failing, but nonetheless there's a drive to expand them. And this is seen as the site to do that. And so we would strongly recommend against that, but I see that my time is up. So I'm going to hand over to Helena from EcoNexus to talk more.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm going to try and tell you what I think climate-smart agriculture might be. Because this is a new buzzword that we have at this conference, climate-smart. What does it mean? Is it just a public relations term? Is it clear in any way? It seems very ambiguous to us. Does it mean support for smallholders and food sovereignty? Or does it really mean support for big industrial agriculture with genetically modified organisms and millions of hectares of no-till chemical agriculture? It's being pushed by the World Bank primarily, with the help of the Food and Agriculture Organization. And they are very, very keen to get it as part of whatever agreement comes out, that it's considered to be climate-smart agriculture. One of the problems is that several African countries are interested in it. Notably, South Africa and the African Union have produced a paper with the World Bank and FAO and UNEP and a number of other big intergovernmental organizations, saying that climate-smart agriculture is very important for Africa and that there must be an agreement on agriculture at this conference of the parties. And one of the things that we've noticed about this is that they are promoting something that they call the landscape approach to agriculture. Now, the Food and Agriculture Organization is very keen to bring the forestry aspect, REDD+, reduction of erosion and deforestation, together with agriculture. So the idea seems to be to say we look at the whole landscape, and in some ways this sounds really positive. We should be looking at the interaction between forests and agriculture. But the problem with it is simply this, that really in the context of carbon markets, with the World Bank wanting to massively expand the carbon market, we are really afraid that it will become a climate-smart agriculture with a landscape approach that entirely looks at carbon. So we reduce the face of the planet to a carbonscape. And this would massively expand the possibilities for creating markets. This is what the World Bank hopes. I think it hopes that by hugely expanding it, it will obviate and overcome this current failure, which is very notable in the European Union, the collapse of the price of carbon. So we're very concerned about this, where this is going, and this is especially concerning because of some of the things that Teresa commented on, notably that the North, the industrialized countries, Annex 1, are still refusing to make commitments or even to honor the commitments that they have already made to reducing their emissions. So obviously they would rather look at a market approach where their emissions are balanced by carbon sequestration in other countries, and they can have a net emission level that is lower than their actual emission level. But this is not what the atmosphere sees. The atmosphere sees increasing emissions. And so we have to be very, very careful that this is not the outcome, that we do not have yet another failure from Annex 1 countries to do what they should be doing, which is to sharply reduce emissions, because sharp reduction is really important for agriculture in order to keep agriculture possible, basically, because in many parts of the world it's going to become very, very much more difficult. And we have to rebuild trust as well, so commitments will help to rebuild trust, we hope, the trust that has been lost in Copenhagen and Cancun from the developing countries, from the G77. Saying we don't trust these negotiations because commitments are never honoured. And what we want to avoid is that agriculture becomes a sort of sticking plaster over this failure, over this aggravated failure to make commitments, to stick to commitments, to commit to a new period of the Kyoto Protocol. And this is very important because agriculture is so vital to Africa, as Teresa said. So we must be careful of not to allow an agriculture agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm also going to read out a small sentence from a colleague who could not be here today, Simon Mwamba of the East African Small Scale Farmers Federation. He says, climate smart agriculture is being presented as sustainable agriculture, but the term is so broad that we fear it's a front for promoting industrial green revolution agriculture too, which traps farmers into cycles of debt and poverty. Now, if any of you want to talk more, we can answer questions about that in the question session. But next, I would like to pass on to my colleague Anne Maina from the African Biodiversity Network.
Thank you, Teresa. I think my colleagues have talked broadly about climate smart agriculture, but one component of the climate smart agriculture that's being promoted by the World Bank is what they call soil carbon markets. And I'd like to speak a little about their first pilot project in Kenya, in the western part of Kenya, in a place called Kisumu. Here in Kisumu, the World Bank has come in and is now working with the Swedish Cooperative Center and VI Agroforestry in the name of promoting soil carbon. The controversy here is that the price of carbon is falling, and they're keen to promote now soil carbon. The price of even setting up an MRV system to measure soil carbon, how much is sequestered, is so expensive that at the end of the day, when you do your maths and you calculate how much the farmers will benefit from the soil carbon, it's between $1 and $5 a year. If you convert that into South Africa rand to bring it into context, it's about 40 rand. And when you check how much the consultants will earn from setting up the system, doing MRV, it's like $1 million a year. And so for us, the work that VI Agroforestry has been doing on the ground with the farmers together with SCC is very good, promoting agroforestry practices that improve the soils. There's mulching, there's use of local compost and organic manure to improve the quality of their soils, because this area has been affected so much by the use of so much chemical fertilizer that their soils are almost dead. But they've been doing this work very well. But now you're creating this expectation by bringing this soil carbon project and telling the farmers, oh, there's more that you might earn some money from it. But when you calculate, it seems the farmers will earn $1 a year. So why create such expectations at the end of the day, and you may cause or jeopardize the work that you're doing, the good work that you're doing. And so we've raised several concerns about this, and this is all related to the broader picture of climate smart agriculture and now soil carbon. If you read from the media, the price of carbon is tumbling, and this is going to be really a disappointment at the end of the day. At the end of the 20 years where they say they want to work for the 20 years, how much will the farmer have earned? What we are calling for as civil society working in Africa is, can we have money going into adaptation practices that are going to benefit the farmers? Can we improve the work that they are doing, improve their soils, invest in smallholder irrigation schemes so that they can produce more and to be able to feed themselves, as opposed to working in the air with soil carbon, which you cannot even measure? Is very difficult. The farmers have been told, okay, form groups. Then you ask them, do you understand how you capture the carbon? They say, no. You grow the trees capture the carbon and it sinks to the soil. But there's more to it when you talk to the people on the ground, the technical people, and they say it's really difficult. And so we are saying that at the end of the day, when we come out of Durban, at the end of when you come out of Durban from here, we'd like to see money going into adaptation measures, and not just adaptation in terms of training. Put money where it is deserved, into irrigation schemes, into improving quality of soils, into mulching, all these schemes, so that at the end of the day the farmer benefits and does not have expectations which might jeopardize the good work that's happening on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne. And our last speaker to talk more about carbon offsets issues is Steve Suppan from Institute of Agriculture and Trade Policy.
Thank you, Teresa. In the interest of giving you time to answer questions, I'm not going to read the statement that I've distributed to you. I just want to draw your attention to the documents on the front row of chairs here, so that if you haven't, if I didn't distribute them to you, you can refer to them. There's plenty of background on this issue. The only thing I'm going to say is that I understand that African ministers of finance are desperate for hard currency after the Wall Street and City of London blow up of the world economy, but this is definitely not the way to acquire such currency, because the price is going to be a devastation, delay in investment to adapt. And now look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, that was very brief, Steve. Thank you.
You've got 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Yes, and just to also add that if you want more information about the issue of soil carbon markets and the impacts that will have, we have a Gaia Foundation briefing called Clear as Mud: Why Agriculture and Soils Should Not Be Included in Carbon Offset Schemes, and I suggest you go look at that from the Gaia Foundation website. So in conclusion, you can tell our concerns, but linking this issue of agriculture to the big picture, we're concerned that the South African hosts have learnt from their former colleague hosts of Denmark and Mexico, of having this practice of basically drafting a paper at the beginning, keeping it for the back, letting everybody else do their negotiations, and then slapping a paper on the table in the last 5 hours and putting a gun to our heads and telling us that we have to sign it or lose out. We saw it happen in Copenhagen, we saw it happen in Cancun, and we have a strong suspicion that this is what's going to happen here in Durban. And this is South Africa is playing a game is playing against the rest of Africa in this context, saying that it's acting in Africa's interest, but it's really not. And so we're very concerned that this agriculture issue is going to be a sop to allow emissions to continue and for the planet to burn. So with that, I will open the floor to any questions. Thank you. Yes, if you could introduce yourself, thank you.
Stephen Leahy with the Interpress Service. Agriculture obviously is a big part of the climate problem. How do you see addressing agriculture's emissions through this convention?
Helena, would you like to go?
Thanks. Well, to be very honest with you, after what I've seen in this convention, I find it very hard to believe that agriculture can really and truly be addressed under this convention. I think it's extremely difficult in view of the sort of interests and the ties to markets and as I said, the reduction of everything to carbon, because the world is far more than carbon. And I really do think that there's a profound danger in trying to cover agriculture under the UNFCCC, that this is simply what will happen. Of course, you might say to me, then how are you going to tackle the emissions? Well, I think that we can tackle the emissions by changing agricultural practices with urgency, and not just because of the emissions thing, because I think if you try to do it in this scenario, it won't work. But if you change agricultural practice, Anne Maina has said that this carbon project is basically, it's good practice. There's all sorts of things in there that we can learn from, that we can extend more widely. Indigenous and small community agriculture is also rich in ideas of how to find the synergies in agriculture, not just to flatten it into a carbonscape, but to find the synergies between livelihoods, between seed sovereignty, food sovereignty, caring for the land, knowing about the land, and really having some hope of local understanding dealing with climate change, in the sense that people with the local knowledge who plant different varieties of crops are a much better hedge against climate change than large industrial fossil fuel emitting agriculture.
Okay, yes.
Pat Carlson, IRN Radio. It sounds to me like you're saying that you believe that governments are more concerned about raising money than lowering carbon emissions, and they're interested in doing that at the expense of the poor. Am I understanding you right?
My take would be it depends on the government. I think that many have been told that there is money, for sure, and that is definitely an incentive for this. But if obviously it's also in their interests to address to help farmers adapt to climate change. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily one or the other. I would say maybe for many governments they believe it's possible to do both. But the issue of carbon markets is that it's a complete myth that carbon markets will bring in money. Like Steve mentioned his documents, but just to give you an idea, the World Bank 2010 report on the state of carbon markets said that there had been actually $144 billion volume of carbon market in the previous year. So African governments are looking at this and going, wow, that's a lot of money that we can participate in. But actually, when you break down the numbers, only 0.2% of that is for project-based transactions. And it's something like 80, am I right, Steve? 84% of that is actually from the derivatives market. Is it 84%? Something like that.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit higher than that. I think the framework of the negotiations is such that there will be a continued imbalance between investment in adaptation and in mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gases. So right now, the proportion of flows is 95% for mitigation, 5% for adaptation, despite the pledge of the Copenhagen Accord to have a balanced approach between mitigation and adaptation. So there's nothing that we know of in the negotiations. Of course, many of these negotiations are taking place in back rooms, but as best we know, there's nothing that is going to change that radical imbalance that will be so harmful for, especially for Africa and for the most vulnerable countries.
And even then, at the end of the day, when you're told you have, 100 million fast-track finance, be it in carbon, being able to benefit from the carbon markets, CDM, it's not, even accessing that money is a big issue. When you talk to African negotiators off the cuff, they tell you, we can't access even this money. You see it listed, but how do you access it? Even those that are really, there's a challenge in maybe developing countries in terms of how to access it. But even those that are able to understand, it's so difficult to access the money to benefit from this. At the end of the day, when they say that the Kisumu project, the Western Kenya project, carbon project is doing very well, it's a pilot that can be shared with the others. But they are benefiting a lot from they say we do not pre-finance, but there's money being put into setting up the system. So the other countries without such kind of support from the World Bank Biocarbon Fund, they cannot run that project and benefit from it.
Yes, and that just brings us to the point that the World Bank has been calling recently for public funds to basically be invested in propping up failing carbon markets, and that is very, very poor use of any climate finance, of public funds to be propping up these carbon markets that are doomed to fail anyway. Any other questions?
Hello, Vernon Rive from Ideologue magazine in New Zealand. New Zealand is a developed country where over 50% of its emissions are from agriculture, and so we're thinking about this a lot at the moment. We have a domestic emissions trading scheme, and the government has recently made a decision to defer the entry of agriculture into the domestic scheme, which has been criticised widely, including by green groups. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the role for emissions trading schemes to address agricultural emissions, both in developed countries and developing countries.
So you have a couple of markets. There's sort of an idealized market, the primary market, in which you are trading either allowance permits or offset credits to try to lower the costs of complying with carbon caps for your largest emitters. But in the design of these markets, there's all kinds of loopholes and trapdoors. And as these credits get resold into the derivatives markets, especially the dark markets, the over-the-counter markets, in which there's almost no regulation, and in which organizations such as the International Swaps and Derivatives Association have been fighting very, very hard against U.S. financial and EU financial market reforms. So there's a great deal of potential for this primary market to essentially be captured and further perverted and further made more volatile, as we've seen happen in other commodities. One of the complaints of major emitters such as E.ON and Exxon is that the carbon price is not only low, but it's so volatile that they can't use it as a basis for calculating a rate of return on investment over the very long period of investment that they have to commit to for major industrial renovation and energy production renovation. So it's a pretty, I've seen some proposals for how you would fix those markets by having very, very tight relationships between caps and auctions. But the concept of auctioning permits in the United States particularly is fought fiercely because the European Commission gave away more than $400 billion of free credits, and the U.S. energy and industrial companies want similar gifts. So the design of these markets is extremely difficult. The political interests are very, very difficult. The idealists in the designer of these markets, such as in the Directorate of Klima and in the European Union, are struggling to try to, in some way, repair the markets that have not been working.
And just to ask in general the question about what would be the solutions to New Zealand's agricultural carbon emissions. I mean, we are now, all of us, operating under the assumption that cap and trade is the norm. But if we remember 11 years ago, there was a real fight to get trade into the discussions about climate change, because we all knew at the time that it had to be about cap. It had to be about cutting emissions, capping and cutting emissions. But suddenly now trade has become the norm to all of us. We need to take a step back and remember that we need to cut. There are ways to cut emissions in agriculture. We could, it's regulation. It's a dirty word, but becoming less so these days, as many of you may have noticed since the economy started collapsing. But I think we should reclaim this word regulation, actually. But basically, cap is another word for regulation, and there are plenty of solutions for agriculture out there for us to, for governments to encourage the right kinds of practices. It could actually be that easy.
Could I just say something briefly about with domestic programs? I think one of the great dangers is, and there was a very interesting comment from Australia when they were thinking about this. This comes from a couple of years ago, but someone was saying, to have a domestic emissions program with agriculture included would be great, because it would mean that Australia could spend another 10 years not doing anything about its emissions, because of, as I said, it will be able to balance them by using its agriculture as a way to produce a net emissions level which is lower than the actual emissions level. And so this is really one of the dangers. We have to have real reductions, not market type net benefit and loss sort of reductions, if you know what I mean.
Okay, yeah.
All right. My name is Tobile Hans. I work for RDNA. It's Reporting Development Network Africa. We are based at Rhodes University. My question is directed to Teresa. She made a mention that the host countries have a tendency of playing double standards. I just need a clarity on that.
What happened in Copenhagen in 2009 was that we all turned up at Copenhagen, and it emerged that the Danish government had secretly been drafting a text with other allies such as the US that completely sold out the Africa and G77 and LDC position, and was completely appalling. Now, actually, the only reason we discovered that was because there happened to be a leak. And so the Africa group responded with complete outrage and were able to take measures, except that in the end the way that Copenhagen finished was a complete disaster anyway. There was green room processes, which is where a few parties get involved in the discussion, everybody else gets excluded, nobody else knows what's going on, and then at the end we get told this is the text and get pressured into signing it with no room for negotiation. Then in Cancun, actually the same thing happened. There were negotiations all week, and but then at the end a text came out that was fully drafted by the Mexican government, and people were mostly applauding because they were saying, oh, this text represents compromise. But actually when they went away, they woke up from their hypnotism and went, what was that? We got nothing from that. And that actually, some countries like Bolivia had been decrying being left out of that process completely. And people now realize that Cancun decision was really not all that it was cracked up to be in the spirit of the moment. So we're concerned that the South African government may be doing something similar, especially because because they're talking about agriculture on one hand, but there hasn't really been much discussion on it in the negotiations so far. I'm told time's up, so thank you very much everyone for coming. Please do check out our Gaia Foundation and IATP websites in particular for more information about carbon trading in agriculture. and documents at the front here too.